Hi everyone, I promise this is the last time that I'm going to be talking to the conference from this end of it at least, so you have a choice for other people to talk to you. So I'm here today to talk about a project that I've been involved in for about the last 9 months, working in collaboration with the Tertiary Education Commission. And I just want to emphasise that everything that I'm talking to you today is an evolving set of ideas and shouldn't be considered to be a policy statement or anything that's an official statement from the TEC. They're aware that what I'm here and what I'm talking about, and they very much buy into it. But I'm an external person brought in to cause as much trouble inside TEC as I cause inside universities. So, yeah, I'm not a TEC employee, and that's the relationship we have. So my role in this work is basically as someone who came up with some of the original thinking around how they might reposition their role in tertiary, and badgered several people inside the TEC over 4 or 5 years to think about different ways that they might conceptualise their role. In order to make sure it's not being led astray by my particular perspective, the project has an external reference group. Professor Sally Kift from James Cook University, Professor Ulf Eilers from Baden-Württemberg Cooperative State University, an international expert in the area of quality and e-learning in particular, and Professor Jeff Scott, who people may have seen as he's working his way around New Zealand and is very much engaged in the changing state of higher education and tertiary education leadership through vocational and higher education. And so their role is to challenge my thinking and to help keep the project steering as well. So it's not just a single perspective that's informing this work. So, what are we trying to achieve? If people think about the TEC, in most cases it's not with a great deal of love in their heart. The TEC is one of several agencies that the government uses to frame tertiary education in New Zealand. And so, just in case there's an international group of folk here less familiar with how things work in New Zealand. New Zealand has a Ministry of Education who work with the Minister to develop policy around tertiary and higher education and to enact the laws that support the operation of the system. The two other key agencies in tertiary are the New Zealand Qualifications Authority, NZQA, who are responsible for accreditation of tertiary providers. In theory, they delegate that accreditation authority to the universities through the New Zealand Vice-Chancellor's Council rather. NZVCC would perhaps represent that relationship differently. And the other third agency that we have in the sector is the Tertiary Education Commission, who very cunningly have been given responsibility for managing the funding, thus allowing the Minister to sit at arm's length from the funding decisions that influence provision in the system. Now, the TEC has in place a standard process which even in New Zealand most people are very much unaware of, which is called the investment plan process. And that approach was intended to provide a rich narrative and a conversation between the TEC and each individual provider about where they thought they best fitted into the system and what was the contribution they could play to making New Zealand tertiary and higher education more effective for our society. They originally started with an idea called charters and profiles, and people who have been around in the sector for a while will remember those things, where there was an attempt to try and frame what it was that the unique contribution of each particular organisation would be. We've moved on a bit from that. But one of the ideas that's been less apparent recently in the investment plans is this idea that they're not purchase and supply contracts. And often they get treated that way. They're about the quantities and the nature and the type and the amount of funding and everything. Certainly that's part of what they do. But they're a really important document representing the relationship between the individual TEOs and the system of tertiary education in New Zealand, and they reflect the responsibility that the TEC has as a steward of that system. One of the things that we're really focusing on this project is this idea that TEC has a responsibility and an obligation to manage the whole system, not just the success of any one organisation within that. And that this is an attempt to give that conversation some nuance and to respect the fact that we're in a really rapidly changing space. So the idea that one central agency can set all of the rules and handle all of the parameters is unachievable and, as you'll see, heavily criticised for the fact that it's just not going to work. So we have a mandate from the Minister to help the TEC create an environment where it's possible for tertiary organisations to become more responsive, to become more adaptive, and to come up with a way of reducing the compliance burden of the TEC relationship with tertiary organisations and increasing the disposition to try new things and to provide an environment that makes that possible. Now, part of that is recognising that why we need to address the space is because we're not very good at it. And that's an acknowledgement of the fact that we're not very good at rapidly responding. A conversation I had yesterday with somebody talking about the changing space we're in was to think if you were going to come up with people who can help particularly younger New Zealanders cope with an environment of rapid change in their personal life, the absence of careers, rapid reskilling and movement, creating their own career path, would you necessarily, for example, regard the university faculty as being the best model and exemplar of people who can share with you strategies for achieving that? And that's a problem, but maybe that also represents the fact that perhaps that's not what universities are actually there to do, which is an interesting conversation. And part of what we're trying to do here is to recognise that this is a conversation that spans the entire tertiary system, which includes people who are not currently customers of existing tertiary organisations. The responsibility for this work is all of New Zealand, all of New Zealanders, and that makes it quite an ambitious scoped exercise. So one thing we really need to emphasise in this is that by talking about a capability framework, I am not talking about a quality framework. So I do a lot of work in the quality space as well. This is not a quality framework. This is not meant to assure anything. It's not meant to account for an audit and make people accountable to somebody for what they're doing. This is an attempt to frame organisational capabilities in ways that reflect an evolving space that we're never really going to be able to quantify in TQM terms or in Six Sigma terms or any of those other ridiculous models. You've heard of these forces. I'm not really going to spend a lot of time. I think the short message is there is a lot of change happening in higher education. There has been for decades. The idea that higher and tertiary education are unchanging places is clearly, utterly, totally ridiculous. The thing that is happening quite a lot, though, is that the pace of technological change is catalysing that rate of change ever more rapidly. So in the past, we've had longer to think about and reflect upon the changing forces acting on tertiary education. Technology is a catalyst. It just speeds that stuff up. And so we have to be conscious of that. I'm very influenced by this book. We actually found, I read this book after I'd started the project, but I thought he captured very well the sort of idea that we're going for here, which is that we're interested not in an absolute efficiency in economic terms, we're interested in the health of a tertiary system. And particularly, one of the ways that a diverse system keeps us healthy is that it provides us with that depth and resilience, different approaches, different models, different ways of engaging. If you think about it, the monocultures that we have in agricultural senses tend to be unhealthy environments. We're after something that isn't leading to a commercially highly focused monocultural provision of tertiary education, but rather coming up with an environment where the TEC can engage with the sector to create a much more diverse system and yet be responsible to the Treasury and to the Ministry in terms of its responsibilities to use the government's money effectively. It's a balancing act. We're also, the ideas that we're engaging with were picked up by the Productivity Commission, so New Zealanders perhaps will be more aware of this than others. The New Zealand government's had a 2-year project with the Productivity Commission to assess the place of new models for tertiary education. I think it basically started with the Minister saying, gosh, those MOOC things are wonderful, can we have an entirely free education system, please? And the Productivity Commission has engaged with that and reframed it, as you do, away from being just about MOOCs to talk about what it is that tertiary systems really can do for the country. It's a 500-page report, which is a challenge. But I think some of the problems they have diagnosed are real and genuine. And being outside the TEC, I can actually say things like, I think the government is deeply wrong in not engaging with the challenge of student loans and thinking about how their management of that side of things is distorting the function of tertiary systems in New Zealand. Happy to have that argument offline with folk. Productivity Commission, a phrase that they've emphasised at the end of their statement in the introduction there. This is what this project is trying to enable. And I think one of the things that we recognise is that creating a tertiary environment, TEC working with the TEOs to do this, is going to take a little bit of time. So we're going to do an initial version of this as part of the 2018 investment planning round. We're already working with a group of TEOs to develop the framework, because it's not a technocratic framework. We haven't started with a list and says, this is what you will do. We are actively engaging in an ongoing program of collaboration to work out exactly what it is that the TEC can do with the sector to achieve this type of outcome. The goal with the capability framework is to provide a context for the TEC to have a conversation with individual TEOs and groups of TEOs such that the TEC can go to Treasury and say, we are very confident that these are highly capable tertiary organisations. We don't need to be monitoring every 5 seconds worth of stuff that they're doing. We can relax some of those compliance requirements. We can start taking some risks with organisations that are doing so in a way that adds genuine value to New Zealand tertiary education. This is really scary for TEC as much as it is for anybody else. So one of the audiences for this work is inside the TEC, helping them understand that it is possible to be a responsible agency and yet do some of these things. It's a conversation. The investment planning process was meant to be a dialogue, and this is an attempt to put some structure to that and to continue that conversation. The interesting thing to emphasise, of course, is that it's not just about who's the best and what are the extra goodies that those people get. It's also recognising that it's just as important to have a framework that has value to organisations which are not necessarily as highly capable. And for the TEC to be able to have a conversation in the context of those investment plans, which is, yes, we're acknowledging that there are some challenges you face. It's legitimate for the investment approach to address those weaknesses and to work with you and to work with perhaps groups of collaborating TEOs to address those weaknesses and build capability. So something I push in virtually every context. It's all about how you act and what improvements you make. It's not about what you measured about your work in the past. So again, we're not interested in what program you delivered last month. We're interested in what you're doing to think about what you're going to be delivering next year and how you might work with other agencies and TEOs. An example of the problem we're trying to solve in this space was illustrated by the report by the Office of the Auditor General around asset management in the tertiary system that was released this year. And one of the things that they pointed out is that every single large capital investment made by the government into New Zealand tertiary education through the TEOs was single TEO focused. Every single one of them only delivered benefits to a single group of learners through a single TEO. And they suggested that that can't continue, that that's not a legitimate and effective use of government public money to only benefit a narrow group. We need to start being able to collaborate in those types of activities. Yes, that is hard. The underlying framework, and you've got the paper so you can read a lot more detail about this, is built around the ideas of capability maturity models, which I have a long experience of engaging with in different ways. This draws on the ideas of some of the work that I've done previously around e-learning capability, but it's a completely new framework in terms of the things that it's engaging with. So we've started from scratch with the group that we're collaborating with to outline what it is that constitutes capability. And we're very conscious that a lot of what the TEC has done in the space of engaging with TEOs has very much been around inputs. How much money are we giving you? And what sort of investment is made in a very input-driven mod with a tiny bit of output focus in terms of how many qualified people are you churning out per quantum of input. We're trying very hard with this model to make sure that we pay attention to the context of an organisation, the inputs obviously, but the processes, the things that enable capability to be built, outputs in terms of what's actually being achieved, but then also the feedback loops. How are we working to re-engage systematically to improve things at the TEO level with collaborative TEOs and then across the whole system? These are the 5 areas that we've chosen as the initial frame. This is an evolving model. Version 1, yes, we'll do some of this. We'll learn, we'll build some experience, we'll build trust and engagement, and then we'll expand the scope of it. Just to give you an example of how that maps out, in each of those 5 areas there are a series of statements framed by the maturity dimensions that I just mentioned briefly. These statements try to frame each item as specifically as possible in a way that's agnostic about the type of TEO. So remember, this is the whole of tertiary in New Zealand, and doesn't assume that you would be face-to-face or online, private or public. None of those things are assumptions built into this. So that makes it challenging. What we will deliver ultimately in negotiation with the sector and with their assistance in developing it are a series of reference statements for all of these, where we'll ask organisations to engage with us and through the investment planning process with support from TEC, conduct their own assessment, talk about where their capability is at, and as part of the investment planning process, they will be funded in alignment with that. That's where we're heading with this as a model. We won't do that immediately. I think the first iteration will be very much about context and understanding with pretty much business as usual around the actual funding. Then we will have opportunities to start influencing the parameters, start negotiating some ways in which the investment plans might operate over different timescales, for example. Some of that stuff requires legislative change, so we won't be able to do it immediately, but this has really strong support from the senior leadership team and the TEC, and this should, with any luck, guide their thinking over the next 3 or 4 years in terms of where we're going. After that, who knows what the world will do. We'll all probably be replaced by AIs. As part of the response to this, once the framework is in use, we're very clearly aware of the fact that we need to work with the sector to build the capacity to engage with these ideas and to build the capacity for change leadership in the sector. So this is a starting point for an ongoing conversation. It's not meant to deliver everything all in a big go. And as always, my work is guided by the very wise man Michael Fullan when he makes the point that we achieve success by not turning ourselves into people like Michelle, who is constantly amazing despite her self-deprecation. We can't build a tertiary system around everybody being that spectacularly engaged with technology and change. We have to change the environment so that the rest of us mere mortals can really be part of something powerful and amazing. All right, I'm going to finish there and open the floor up for questions. Thank you very much. And it's great, they've changed the lighting so I can actually see you. Yes. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So I'm PBRF measurable as well, so I know exactly what you're talking about there, absolutely. So one of the things that we did deliberately is that we've put research out of scope for this framework, and we did that for a couple of sensible reasons. One, it's a learning and teaching focus that drove us here. That's where this money comes from. I think the government is increasingly conscious of the fact that the PBRF has distorted the positioning of the universities, particularly with respect to their learning and teaching activities. So my sense is that this is a fast-moving space and we should watch what's happening here, yeah. But basically we don't want to repeat anything that even vaguely resembles the PBRF. Yeah, absolutely. Let's hear it for Queen. Any other questions? All right. Oh. Mm-hmm. Sure. So some of the drivers for the framework come from the things that the government have said are not optional for tertiary. So we have a mandate through the tertiary education strategy to focus on the needs of Maori, Pacifica, people leaving school, and to ensure that tertiary education aligns well into the employment space. Now, I might argue with whoever wrote that, and do frequently argue with those priorities as being the defining framework for New Zealand tertiary, but that is the context we're in right now. So we're using that one as an example of something that isn't optional and is required as part of the operation of an effective tertiary system, and actually is important that we continue to support the growth of the country's economic system. The intention here is to shift that away from being a production engine of a generic qualification to recognise that our relationships with employers must be much deeper. Now, one of the things that we're going to do, and I'm doing this on Friday in a workshop with TEOs, is we're going to take exactly the same sorts of questions and say to people who work as Maori providers and with Maori students, what is the appropriate way to frame the level of engagement that the Maori community expect of tertiary in exactly that same space? So that's an example that we're working with them, and we're going to say, guys, you tell us what it is that should be valued in that space so that we can engage with it. And we'll do that with a number of other areas. Yeah. So what we will be doing as part of the final delivery of the model to the TEOs is that we will align the metrics and other tools and measures that are available to TEC into the framework. So the goal is that when the investment manager comes to the TEO, that they won't turn up with a blank set of boxes and say, right, what do you want to fit in here? They will come with what the TEC already knows, which in some cases is extensive as a sort of a starting point for conversation. But again, the focus is not really on accountability for where you've been. It's more about how are you thinking about where you're going to go and what are you doing as an organisation to build that capacity in the future. And many of our existing measures are frankly proxies for things that we really care about that have got more to do with ease of measurement than they've got to do with making us a more effective system for the future. Yeah. So the first rollout of this will happen in October of this year as part of the investment planning process for 2018. So it's a very tight schedule. And we'll be making everything available through the TEC website and sharing it more generally after that. And it will evolve from that point. So yeah, we're engaging with the sector currently, and we've done that through the TEC's relationships with TEOs. So a wide group of TEOs have already been involved in having that conversation with us. I expect, and I'm very, very happy to get feedback in response to the paper and to this talk. And as the project becomes more visible across the sector, we expect people to be feeding into it actively. So we started with a series of consultations inside the TEC and with the TEOs and also with the tertiary education strategy, and we said, what is it that is, what does the system need to be capable of doing? And then we also match that up with a review into the literature about what it is that organisations need to be doing in a forward-thinking way. But part of the trick with this process is that it isn't a technocratically defined framework, so I haven't started by saying this is what you want. We've gone out and asked some fairly open questions with people about what's your response to us engaging with this issue? How do you think this would affect your ability to be more effective in this space? Because we need something that's pragmatic, that can be understood by tertiary managers particularly. And remembering some of these are very small organisations with a very much a lean business operation, whereas others are quite substantial and have quite a distributed and complex organisation with multiple stakeholders. So, yeah, it's challenging. All right. Yeah, Bronwyn. Very good, actually. Better than the universities. Yeah. So we've had PTEs, Wananga, and ITOs, and a single university in the consultation active sessions that we've had so far. We're hoping to get more over the rest of the year. Interestingly, the group that I didn't mention in there, if people are paying attention, is ITOs. They are in scope for this project. It's just that their model is sufficiently different that we're treating those as a sort of a version 1.5 problem to try and articulate exactly how they act in this way, because it is slightly different to everybody else. Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone.
Cheers.